Welcome back to our C-Suite series. In this installment titled Legacy and Beyond Visionary CEOs, we venture beyond the corporate facade to uncover the personal triumphs, trials, and transformations of remarkable leaders. These individuals have scaled the peaks of business success and navigated the complex journey of arriving and redefining their life's purpose post peak career achievements. Today, we're joined by Rahul Pandey, former CEO of CollabraLink and a distinguished MBA graduate of the Michigan Ross, who led CollabraLink Technologies to new heights in the federal contracting world. Rahul, thank you for being here today as we offer our listeners an intimate glimpse into your life. Could you start by sharing what inspired you to pursue an MBA and enter the federal contracting sector?
Absolutely, Ton. And first of all, thank you for having me. Super excited to be here. I also wanted to note that I think it's such a full circle moment for me because back when I started CollabraLink, and I think it was 2010, I had met you and became a client of your intellect business. And so it's kind of crazy to me that here we sit 13 or 14 years later, and I'm now being interviewed by you in terms of, kind of having climbed the mountain and now, kind of getting my takes on it. So total full circle moment. So in terms of what motivated me to pursue an MBA and then eventually get into government contracting, those two things were completely unrelated and in fact almost contradictory. So I went to the University of Michigan to get my MBA specifically because I was very, very fatigued with IT consulting. So pre-MBA, I worked at Accenture. Back then, it was actually called Anderson Consulting when I first joined. So that'll date me a little bit.
Wow, that does go way back.
That's right. But it became Accenture. I climbed the ranks there and just kind of got burnt out on IT. And I thought, I need to do an MBA to kind of understand broader business. And I got, sort of that grounding at Michigan in business strategy, in marketing, in entrepreneurship, and finance and accounting. And I felt, that was a good sort of foundation to have. From there, I pursued strategy consulting. So I didn't get right into government contracting. I didn't get right into entrepreneurship. I became a strategy consultant at a firm called LEK, which was a small boutique that spun out of Bain and Company back in the 80s. And all the work that I did there was purely growth related. So, all of our studies, all of our cases were what new market should we enter? What new what new product should we develop? What new geography should we enter? What company should we buy? These were the questions that we were answering for these clients of ours. And so it was all very growth oriented. But about 2 years in, I was newly married, planning to start a family, and kind of feeling like I was ready for that next segment of my career. And everybody who had left LEK from my office, I was in the Chicago office, that was at my level, sort of post MBA, had transitioned into private equity. And that was my plan all along. I had a plan. I wanted to, sort of follow a blue blood pathway of MBA, strategy consulting, private equity, and I had it all figured out. And in 2008, when I was embarking on that sort of journey of finding a private equity gig, things started going off the rails with the economy. And I think it was Bear Stearns that had collapsed first. Yep. And all of a sudden, all these private equity funds basically just would tell me, hey, come back in a year. We're not hiring, there's no deal flow. Things have really shut down, come back in a year. And I was just crestfallen because I had prepared my whole CV in specific pursuit of this like very blue blood pathway that I thought I was going to go down. And it didn't work and I had to pivot. And right at that moment, I had a conversation with my folks. And my dad said to me, and I remember this very distinctly, my wife and I were back home in the suburbs visiting my parents. And my dad said to me, why don't you come join CollabraLink? And I thought, oh my God, he's crazy. Is he out of his mind? CollabraLink was the mom and pop shop that my dad and mom had started for him to be an independent consultant. And I was just, I immediately dismissed the idea, thinking that's absurd. Why would I have spent all this time and energy getting this MBA and kind of building my resume in a certain direction? But then as I kind of left that conversation, and as parents tend to do to their children, he had planted a seed in my head, and I started kind of thinking about it, and I started contemplating, well, what if, what if I joined CollabraLink? And at that point, it was my dad, and he had one employee. And I really started to just think about the scenarios in my head of, well, this is kind of an opportunity for me to try my hand at being an entrepreneur. This is an opportunity for me to spend some quality time with my dad, who at the time was in his mid 60s. And if it
That
didn't,
MBA to use, right? Like you had an MBA, you were highly educated.
right, and put the stuff that I'd learned at Ross to use, and the stuff I'd learned at LEK to use. And so it was like, I always tell people now, as I look back on it, I think my dad played a Jedi mind trick on me. And so, long story short, I very reluctantly joined CollabraLink, which at that time was a commercially focused, sort of, I'd call it IT/process consultancy.
Was it Motorola? I think was one of the main clients at that time, because
Yeah,
you were my client number two.
right.
So I remember those years very vividly. It's like, oh, Motorola, I think.
That's exactly right. Motorola was the main client. It was my dad's former employer before he started CollabraLink, and then he went back there as an independent consultant under the CollabraLink sort of flag. And he had one employee, and we were doing process work for them. And so I got to work just kind of helping him think about, well, how do we grow this thing? And kind of really leveraging that MBA and the strategy consulting work of like, where can we generate revenue? And so we sort of made up a big board, and commercial was the most obvious choice. It was Motorola. We had a few other potential customers in the hopper. And then there was this federal thing that was out there. And I thought, maybe this might be interesting to explore, but not right now. And so we got to work on building a commercial business. But as is true in most any entrepreneur's journey, we got thrown a curveball, and that was the continued sort of decline of the overall economy. So after Bear Stearns collapsed, Lehman Brothers collapsed, and if you remember that time, I mean, it's now referred to as the Great Recession. Basically, everything went off a cliff from an economic perspective. And so Motorola shut down our project midstream. When I joined, I'd helped my dad win a long 1-year project with them. We ramped up to about 3 employees, and 6 months in, they shut it down. And that's when I thought, oh man, I really need to go figure things out here and figure out how we're going to generate revenue. And that's what led us to GovCon, right? So sort of this meandering path that, it didn't start with the intention of building a government contracting business. I mean, I was sitting in Chicago after all. But yeah, that was kind of the sort of precursor to us making a foray into federal. And I started jumping on planes, because the short answer of where do I generate revenue was, well, the only place spending right now is the US federal government, right? That's the only customer that had budget at the time. And so I started jumping on planes coming out to DC. That's when I met you, Tom. And I sort of began to kind of get myself steeped in what does it take? How do you even win a government contract? What does it take to be successful? What are the guys that are having success doing that I can replicate? That's sort of the origin story of CollabraLink and how we got our way into federal way back in that 2009 timeframe.
Yeah, so that's a really great segue into like our first segment, which is the CEO profile. And I remember 2008 vividly. And 2010 was when my son was born. And, with you being my second client, it was one of those make or break, couple of years where you're like, oh my God, am I crazy for doing this? I thought to myself, am I crazy for taking this client on? He had no government experience. He's flying out to Baltimore, and I actually did come across your first original CAPE statement.
Oh, no way.
And
I love
yes,
this.
I will have to send that to you. I forget what title you gave me, but I had a like director for federal contracts type of title to
Yeah.
give you a DC presence. And when I look at our work product from back then versus where we are now, we have both come such a long way in both
This
of
is
our
basically,
fields.
like, it's so amazing to me that those very, very sort of meager, beginnings led to something that was just, way bigger than I ever imagined. I mean, it's really, kind of, to me, just inspiring to think back at just how much we were just shooting from the hip and
Yep.
how meager those beginnings were and what it yielded. I mean, it's pretty cool.
Yeah, no, it's pretty incredible. And so, but you've matured and you've grown, and CollabraLink saw some really impressive growth. What can you recall or share some strategies that you might have implemented that maybe drove that success? And I know, your father had a huge influence and guidance in that whole, business approach, but what part of his leadership style and um, did you adopt, or did you kind of come up with your own to, be successful? So I'm really trying to get into um, determining what makes a really great CEO, because sometimes, like you said, we kind of stumble on this, by accident, and we kind of mature and develop as, we go along, learn and fail.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll just start with that last question you asked me first around my dad and what things I learned from his leadership style and his influence. My dad and he's 80 today, and he's still living a great life with my mom and traveling the world. But my dad is and always has been an eternal optimist. So I remember the first day of my tenure at CollabraLink, my dad turned to me and he goes, "Rahul, we're going to build $100 million business." And I was like, "This guy is crazy. We don't even have like 100,000 of revenue, and he thinks we're going to build $100 million business." And I've always been a very practical, pragmatic, and sometimes people would say even like had a little tinge of pessimism in my
You do.
overall outlook. Yeah, and
You
that's
do.
just how I'm wired. I have a little, maybe it's a healthy sometimes, but unhealthy level of paranoia and anxiety. And my dad is just completely on the opposite end of the spectrum. And I really learned a lot from that, right? Because as a leader, you have to think big, you have to have a big vision, and it's okay for that to be just sort of pie in the sky because that's what you're shooting for. And I'm so glad that he counterbalanced my sort of, kind of more pragmatic style, because it was such a breath of fresh air to have somebody on the team that was just like, no, we're going to make something huge out of this, and I'm confident in that. So that was like the key thing that I really got from my dad. And then he also sort of never it wasn't even like I could term it as this when it was during that period, but now looking back, he had a lot of grit. It was
Yeah.
sort of just like, oh, that didn't work. The thing that we tried, let's go try this other thing. Like it was kind of like ho hum, like let's just keep going, heads down, just keep cranking away at it. And so I also took a lot of that and implemented that in my leadership journey. But now there was like, in addition to that, right, you asked about some of the other strategies that we implemented, and there were some very pure play tactical things that I did that I want to relay to the audience that led to success. I mean, number one, I built relationships. I came out to DC, I ran around the Beltway and tried to build relationships with, big primes, tried to build
Mhm.
relationships with the federal agency OSDBU offices, I try to build relationships with successful small business owners so I could get some mentorship. So I sort of really was hyper focused on, building those relationships and not being, pesky or annoying, but instead being like just, very deliberate and intentional with their time and with the way that I approached it. And that helped a ton because as a result of that, I found a bunch of mentors who had had success and I could pick their brain. I built relationships with some of these large primes in order to get, some contract experiences. And in fact, the
Mhm.
large prime, and I call them large prime, the software company that I built the tightest relationships with was Appian. And back then, Appian was this small, very like fledgling startup. But I built a relationship with one of their VPs who ran their professional services division, and that yielded fruits. And so that was key for me, building relationships. The second thing was I had a plan, right? But I was very flexible or adapt. Like that plan could be shape shifted and adapted. And so, my plan was, kind of go out, get a GSA schedule, get an 8A, sort of find deals that were within our wheelhouse, which at the time was like process and process automation, and that meant Appian, um, and then see where that took me. So I had a plan, but then sometimes that would take a right turn, and I would just adapt and follow accordingly. But it was important to me, and I think it's important to anybody listening to this that if you're going to go about being an entrepreneur, it's great to fly by the seat of your pants, but it's always you need a guiding framework, you need a guiding plan, um, and that was a key
Definitely.
to our
You have
success.
to find balance between that, right? Is that I think a lot of times people come in too stringent on one side or the other.
Yeah,
Either they're very, very restrictive to their plan. I've got a plan. I can't divert from it. I can't pivot from it. And we both kind of came up through the period where there was a lot of volatility. There wasn't, we went through and survived continuing resolution, sequestration,
right.
several BRAC initiatives, so that was a really, really kind of tough decade, the first 10 years of business where come year 5 or 7, you're like, "Oh my god," like, "Did I really make the right decision into, like, jumping into this sector?" Um, but the one thing that you mentioned that really kind of, like, resonates with me is the relationship part, and I know we spent a lot of time in those early years, building relationships, attending events, getting in front of as many people as possible and putting our best foot forward, but not to be transactional about it. And I'm so glad that you use the words deliberate. Because you have to be deliberate in who you meet with, why you're meeting with them. They're important people, they're busy people, and having like a really good game plan and understanding of like, why am I talking to you? Why, like, what can you benefit and how are you going to benefit? Can we mutually benefit from this conversation and these relationships? Because I think a lot of times, new people in this industry are very transactional. They treat me in a very transactional way. And I kind of figure if you treat me this way, I'm not open to introducing you to, my contacts or anyone in the government because I don't want you to treat another partner or someone, in the same manner.
That's right.
And so kind of recognizing that aspect of relationship building, I think is really important.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and it's just like, uh, leaning into being a genuine, being genuine and not, um, and sort of as you described, if you treat things transactionally, it's just not going to go well. And I've had many conversations where folks are looking for mentorship, and it was even during the CollabraLink run, and you could just tell that this wasn't something that it was something that the person across the table was maybe treating transactionally, and it's an immediate turnoff. Like you don't want to engage that
Hmm.
when you get approached that way.